Before I introduce our first guest, I wanted to thank him for graciously answering my call for help to help me find my way through Wisconsin and pointing me into the directions of some very good people who are helping me and who you will be speaking to throughout this week. In many ways, Greg Borowski is probably the ideal person to set the table for the issues that we're going to be examining today. As executive editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, he leads a staff that is working every day to separate fact from fiction with an abiding appreciation for covering the Capitol as high-stakes journalism, something that he knows quite a lot about as a reporter who's come up through the ranks, a City Hall reporter who's landed at the top spot at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And as Ann said, I hope you come armed with questions because you can take your frustrations out on an editor without having to work in his newsroom. So with that, I'll take it to Greg and thank him for spending his time with us tonight. Wherever you're comfortable.
I think I'll start here just because I got papers. And then
okay.
All right, well, thanks for that great introduction. And to the National Press Foundation, everyone for this event. I think it's a great opportunity for you guys to make some connections and find those commonalities and really dig in for a few days. Hopefully, you're not going to have to be checking your phones all day and filing stories and responding to editors, because it should really give you this time to dig in and learn and build some of those skills and that knowledge. So I have just some thoughts about the work you do, but I want to leave the most time here for questions. And I want to start out by saying that your job is one of the toughest, if not the toughest, not just in your newsroom, but I think in journalism today. And that's not just me blowing smoke. So if you think about it, over the years, there's been a lot of talk about the erosion of staffing at the State House, and the numbers, surely remain down, so that's your first challenge. But that state government coverage remains one of the few areas where I think there is consistent competition, and you may feel as you do your job day to day, there's just no time to really breathe. You've probably got multiple newspapers with a presence at the Capitol. TV stations are coming in at least on the big news days. You maybe have Axios in your market, or Politico, or a nonprofit, or some kind of startup. And if you're in a competitive state, there's always the chance that the Post or the Times drops in with a story. In our case here last year, the Post came along and hired one of our reporters in order to compete against us. So that's kind of what you're facing. I shouldn't complain too much, because we then, to replace that reporter, we hired somebody else and we're competing against them. So we're playing that same game. But it's a super competitive environment that you guys are in that most other parts of your newsroom might not be. At the same time, I don't think the stakes could be any higher for what you're doing. So even if you simply look at the issue of elections and all the battles over voting and voting rights, absentee ballots, drop boxes, access to the ballot, this 14th Amendment issue that's floating out there, these are all things that have real and direct consequences, and how effectively you cover them is going to make a real difference in what happens. And that can't be understated. For all the attention that will be paid in the 2024 election, and all the ink that will be spilled, all the pixels that will be, I guess they get pixelated, it's going to come down to a handful of voters in a handful of states with a handful of reporters who are tasked with holding those officials accountable, explaining what's happening, and providing information that those voters need to, really put it bluntly, decide the fate of the country going forward. And some of those reporters are in this room. So that's a huge task you guys face. And that's just the politics side of the equation. Now, I'm imagining that many of you have state government and politics in your title, that it's not just a political reporter. And on the state government side, I think this beat is, by its nature, one of the most expansive in the newsroom. I'm a former state government reporter myself in Michigan at the Lansing State Journal in the 1990s, and that was what I really loved about the beat, was the expansiveness of it. So one day I could be writing about environmental policy, the next about the correctional system, the next about highways and infrastructure, the next about college affordability, the next about school financing, and sometimes that was just Monday. What's more, you're doing all of this at a time of raw political polarization in an era where journalists face intense scrutiny from elected officials, campaign managers, department heads, and voters alike. And you're doing this at a time when anyone can be targeted on social media with vitriol. I'd call it astonishing vitriol, but it's hard to be astonished by what we see anymore, aimed at attacking and undermining the core work that you do, and attacking the credibility of you and the institution you work for. Now, I know you know all of that. You know it quite well, I'm sure. But I think it's important to note it up front to kind of set the table as you enter the training sessions and to recognize the stress and strain that this puts on you. If you stop and question from time to time, or even every day, why you got into this mess, that's perfectly normal, okay? I used to do that when I was covering government, and all the time. The question really is, how do you respond to those challenges, and how do you tackle them going forward? I say this too to recognize up front that you guys are operating in a different world than I was when I was covering state government. I'll give you just one measure of how different it is. In the mid-1990s, the Michigan legislature limited the state funding system for K-12 education. They literally just said it's going away, and they gave themselves a deadline of a couple of months to try to rebuild it in a more fair and sustainable way. Now, there was plenty of partisanship back then, but it was not the type that you see today. There was a strong middle, and it was needed because the chambers either had a strong minority, or in the case of the House for one term, had an even split of 55 seats to 55 seats. So often the process of reaching agreement meant many, many late nights, and sometimes even on Fridays and into the weekend. So one of my most telling memories from those nights is from those nights, when the first TV reporters packed up and left once they finished the 10 p.m. live shots. Then the print reporters would leave one by one as each outlet's deadline passed, knowing we could get some sleep, and the poor AP reporter was stuck there to the bitter, bitter end to watch it unfold. Sometimes we would stay to watch it, to see what happened, but we didn't have to worry because there was no online presence. We weren't having to tweet. We weren't having to file instant updates. We knew we would have plenty of time to catch up later. So I'm telling you this, why am I telling you this? It's clearly a world away today from what it was. But I'm telling you first because it's a reminder that no matter how hard you work, no matter how many hours you put in, you can't do everything. And it's a reminder, too, that sometimes you need a mental break and to take care of yourself. And I share it especially as a reminder that you make choices every day on what to cover and how to cover it. Those long nights are about the nitty-gritty of school finances and funding and formulas. And I'm as proud of our coverage at the State Journal from those days on that issue than of any candidate visit, presidential debate, and we had one of those, national conventions, we covered those. And there are all sorts of other things, but I'm really proud of that meat and potatoes coverage around what was happening. So we created our own databases, and we mimicked the state funding formula, so we could almost instantly show our readers how each plan would affect school funding payments in each district. We tracked each proposal. We gave readers opportunities to engage by calling their lawmaker, attending a forum, sitting down and meeting in community discussions. We did that sort of thing on a whole lot of issues. when everyone was concerned about the state of Michigan's roads, which I imagine are probably as bad as they were. They're bad. But we created a build-your-own budget that let readers raise the gas tax or tap other sources and determine how many miles of highway could be paved by how much they were willing to spend. We were constantly soliciting reader views on top issues and what they wanted to see done. And this was pre-internet, mind you. So it was a questionnaire readers would clip out and mail back to us. Then we would organize them into piles, and we could call people for comments on topics of interest. We'd ask our readers to help us set the coverage agenda for an election year. What were the top issues they wanted to know about? And when we wrote about each of those issues, we would push the candidates for a position on key proposals and on pending bills, and we would leave it blank, when they refused to do that. Those approaches were the result of some big choices we made. But I think it's important to remember is we all make such choices every day. And sometimes the decisions you make on what to cover are so small and seem so natural that you don't even realize you're making them. But over time, they result in your coverage either drifting in one direction or the other. And it can drift more toward state government or more toward politics. Now, I know nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to ignore policy, ignore the impact of what I'm writing about, ignore my audience and its needs, and focus just on the horse race. But it happens, I think, bit by bit, and eventually we find our coverage deep in the world of insiders, steeped in a place where everything is about who is up, who is down, who's using what strategy, what can they do next. It's a place where there's always a winner and always a loser. And let's be honest, those are often the easiest stories to do. Who won the debate? Who's up in the polls? Who's announcing a campaign? Who's dropping out? Who's fighting whom? Who's winning? And let's be honest again, those stories can be fun. You got smart takes and hot takes, and you can really provide that knowledge, but it's kind of a surface level thing. So I want to pull us back for a minute and ask what our coverage would look like if the who was phrased this way. Who are we writing this story for? Is it for the people at the Capitol, our editors back in the newsroom, or someone clicking on our story, or hopefully picking up a newspaper on their porch or turning on the TV or radio and listening through? And if we asked, why is this story important to them? Why is it important to tell and to tell it now? And what is the proper framing of the story? Is it the committee vote and whatever incremental step is next? Or is it what the bill will mean in a practical way if it's enacted? And when is the right point to really dig in on the implications of the story? When it's first introduced, when it's poised for passage, when you can do a solid job on it and not just bang out 20 inches and a bunch of bullets. I'm going to put the where and the how together. Where is the best place to tell the story? That is, what platform and how? Is it even a text story at all? Or is it better as a video or a chart? Should it be presented as a Q&A or takeaways or a narrative or 5 things to know? Or is it really and truly one of those rarer cases when the absolute best way to tell it is how we have told stories, especially in newspapers for centuries, in dense type, in an inverted pyramid style, hoping the reader will keep reading past the boilerplate background, turn the page, or continue scrolling to the end? So I want to give an example of one story about our coverage late last summer of a Donald Trump rally at the Journal Sentinel. So we made arrangements to send Molly Beck, who you'll meet on Wednesday, to cover it. And we assigned her the normal main bar kind of story that you might expect. Then a summer intern, Isaac Yu, asked if he could cover the event too, mainly because he wanted to have the experience. So we sent him there, and Molly was assigned the main story, and Isaac we assigned to write a takeaways story. And at the end of the day, when it came to online readership, Isaac's story performed something like 3 to 4 times better than Molly's did. And it wasn't because he had 3 to 4 times the insight as Molly Beck did. It was because we presented it in a format that was accessible to readers, It was constructed in a way that respected their time, pulled out the most important points, and did not require the reader to wade through a screen full of text. I think we would all be better off if every reporter, not just government and political reporters, every reporter started their day with two questions. One is, what is the most important thing happening in my coverage area today? And two is, how can I best communicate it to the people most affected by it? I'm glad this training program is happening now at the relative beginning of the election cycle. Though we know in many states there is no end to the election cycle, it just cycles and cycles and cycles. But it's good to think about what happens when things start to drift. So if your aim is to figure out the best ways to serve the reader and the public, the best way really to be serving democracy, and that's not being too lofty in the stage we're in, just picture it as a straight line. If you start on that straight line and say, here's the goal where we want to wind up with that sort of coverage, and you get nudged off it, story by story, day to day, especially at the beginning, your track is going to take you far, far away than if you make these decisions along the way that keep you on that path and get you where you want to go at the end. So it's important, I think, to start early, because you get nudged off early on, you're going to wind up further and further away. Now, I know it's hard to fight the drift. Politics is easy. It's combat, it's winners and losers, it's ups and downs, fights and battles. There is always a story to be written about politics. And when your editor needs something in a hurry, that's the one folks turn to more often than not, I think. But state government is hard. It's all about nuts and bolts and nuances. It's understanding Medicaid reimbursement and the school aid formula. It's budgets and line items. It's how things are working in the classroom, at the DMV, inside courtrooms, in the state park system. Covering government this way means that what happens at the Capitol when a bill is passed or a policy is approved is the start, not the finish. And you have to be an expert in everything, not just the tactics and the battlefield. I always reflect, I still have to, somewhere I have a comic strip that someday I'm going to come across it and have it handy for these moments, but it's a picture of a man who's blindfolded, and he's got a dart in his hand, and he's throwing it at a board that says, today I'm an expert in, and on the board are 50 different topics, all the things you can imagine on state government, and he's blindfolded, ready to throw it because he doesn't know what the day's going to lead to. But that's sort of the challenge you guys face. So I do want to say, if you find yourself going months and months and months without quoting someone who's affected by what is happening or examining it from their perspective, you're doing it wrong. Okay, you're not providing that service to democracy that we need. Now, some of this, of course, will require a little self-reflection. So I encourage you to stop for a minute and think about your own why. Why are you in this business? And on this beat of all beats, what motivates you? Are you a hyper-competitive adrenaline junkie? Because you'll get some of that. Do you live for the scoop and tweeting everything to beat the competition? Is it because you like to be at the center of the action, right at the debate or the news conference, being there when the votes are counted? Now, you may need those skills and that attitude to succeed, but I hope the answer is different. And I assume that's why you're here, because you want to serve the community, that you feel the same calling others do to serve, and that you want to do it well and as completely and fairly and comprehensively as you can. So I salute you for that. Now, remember where I started in saying this is the toughest of jobs. So in closing, before I'll sit down and take any of your questions, I want to add an important note there. Take care of yourself. And I'll say it again, take care of yourself. Take some time to step away and refresh. Take some time to drink a beer with a colleague, or better, with a friend who is not in journalism. And if you don't have anybody like that, find some friends who are not in journalism, okay? Take time to go for a walk, or go for a run, take a day off, or even two. Trust that your coworkers will have your back. It's important that you do that. And if your editor won't tell you that, I will. It's important, too, to know there will be days that really, really suck. Okay? They will be long and they will be hard. There will be days when that story you've worked on for a month shows up as a scoop in the New York Times. There'll be days when no matter how clearly you wrote something, someone out there wants to distort it. There'll be days when one of your subjects or one of their allies puts you on blast on social media, and the insults and vitriol will just pile up and wear you down. There'll be days when your editor demands another story, and then another story, and let's face it, I can say this as an editor, probably a third story. There'll be days when you ask yourself if what you're doing is important, if it really matters, and there'll be days when it's hard to see that it does. Okay? On those days, if no one else out there will tell you otherwise, I want you to send me a text or an email or simply tweet in my direction, because I will respond and tell you just that we need you, this work is important, you are important, and you must keep at it. We all must keep at it. Thank you. So I'm going to sit here, and you can throw your complaints about your editors to me. I won't tell them about it, even if I happen to know them, or any other questions, things you guys may have.
Hi, thank you. I was hoping you could speak more about deciding what things you want to cover. As you mentioned, there's so many things in state government that I could write about anything, any particular day. Is there a reader in your mind's eye that you're always thinking about, something they might not care about this, they really should know about that? What does that reader look like to you?
Yeah, I think it's important to have that reader in mind, but I would encourage you not to just pick a single reader. Sometimes people advise you, I'm writing for my grandmother. And they say, well, that's great. Well, first, she's dead in my case, but that's also, well, whoever they're writing for, they have a narrow perspective too, and you don't want to be writing just for that person. You want to think of people, groups, folks that maybe aren't reading your paper or listening to your newscast on a regular basis. But I think if you, and I haven't really thought all this through yet, but if you took like when you think of those, X, the matrix, you have the line horizontal and vertical, and then you say, well, here's the most important, least important, impact the most people, impact the least people, and kind of figure out on that story, where does it go? I mean, that's just sort of a real rough guide of, is this something that's very important and affects a lot of people? Is it a very important and affects even a small group, but in an important way? But if you're spending a lot of the time in it's not too important and it doesn't affect a lot of people, that's where you really want to adjust and get out of that quadrant, because you can do that exercise on a lot of things. What you want to be paying most attention to places where it's going to make a difference, because you can't cover every bill that's out there, certainly not with the same depth. Sometimes you have to decide that if there's one really good enterprise story around that bill, is it best to do it when the bill is introduced because it's or is it when it's going through committee because that's the key point? Will it pass or won't it pass? Is it something that is so greased that it's going to go through anyways? Do you just hold off and write it closer to when the governor signs it? There's things like that I think you can sort of factor in a practical way. You get a lot of, and I'm hesitant sometimes to say, look at the metrics on your stories, especially because you will probably see some of the raw political stories do better than the policy stories. But you can, if you separate out and say, hey, these are some more policy stories, or this issue, how is it resonating? It's not a bad word to look at metrics and clicks, because each click is a person. Right? So someone clicked on that story because they have an interest in it. And you can use that to some degree too, to say, here's something that, boy, I hadn't written much about that before, but there is an audience building around that. And maybe that means you can dig in a little bit and write a second story or a third story and really test out your gut and your sense on that to see, is this something that is going to resonate with people, or is it something that just is going to fall flat?
Thanks. Alex Degman, WBEZ in Chicago. You mentioned in your answer just now, you mentioned about when to start a story, when to broach a topic, and it's particularly interesting for me because in one of my previous Statehouse jobs, I worked for a network that most days, it wasn't all Statehouse, but about 80% of it was, and we were pulling something like 24, 28 sound bites a day, and that's even when they weren't in session. And now I'm at a publication, an outlet that doesn't have those same daily pressures and has more people to spread the work around, so I'm able to dig into things a little bit more, but I'm still struggling with trying to figure out when to write a bill, because so often in Illinois, the things that people are talking about are not things that are serious proposals. Like Chicago is never going to become its own state. Southern Illinois is not going to, broach off and form its own state, stuff like that. So we run into this issue of, do we write about it when it's a proposal, when it's in committee, when it passes the chamber the first time, when it passes the second, and there's 7 opportunities to write about it. So I guess just if you could elaborate on that a little bit, is it just really a case-by-case basis? It depends on what the issue is, and is there a way to, is there an easy way out, I guess is what I'm looking for here.
The easy way out. I think it is largely case by case, but I would emphasize that you've got a lot of tools in your toolbox in terms of how even for radio, but I'm thinking especially in print, and even radio and TV, you've got a digital presence on that too. And you're probably going to write about this issue over and over again, especially if it's going to sort of grind its way through the process. And you'll find yourself writing a lot of boilerplate into that story. And you're almost by definition, I think, when you're writing the daily story, this bill passed committee, this did whatever, your audience is really the people in the Capitol, because they're the ones who care. Did it? There'll be some cases where this bill is really a close call, is it going to pass or not, and people might be waiting on that. But often it's predictable. You guys probably know as a bill is introduced, you can predict, what kind of path it's going to take and where its hurdles are going to become. So those stories are fine. But if you stopped and at the beginning said, I'm going to write a story that's in a Q&A format that says, here's what this bill would do, and you have your online folks really work with you on, catching search traffic and things like that, you've got an element there that takes some of the pressure off you every time you've got to write about that bill. Because you can link to that, you can refer to that, and readers are going to find that on their own by searching for it. And in a way that becomes a tell of what people are interested in. So that should free you up. Because for me, I think what shackles a lot of reporters, not just in state government, is when you're writing that turn of the screw incremental story, and you feel like in order to adequately explain it, you've got to get it to 18 or 20 inches, and 70 to 80% of that is boilerplate, and there's a quote from each side, and you're really not, the news in that story of what's genuinely new is so, the proportion of that to the type or the time or whatever you're asking, however you're measuring it, is so small that I think a lot of time gets lost in writing those sorts of stories that way. If you freed that up, you could say, look, boss, we only need to write a brief about this bill passing committee because we've got all this background on it, and we simply need to say it passed the committee, and the next stop is the floor, which expects to vote next week or whatever, and take that time and reinvest it around, well, what would that bill do? Is there a person out there who's impacted by it? If it's a bill about, school funding and the classrooms, have you gotten out to talk with, educators and parents? And if you personally haven't, is there someone else on your staff who you can partner up with? You should. If I'm in that role today, I would want as many double bylines as possible so that those stories are connected with other reporters who are maybe more on the front lines and can more readily find that school teacher or the prison guard or the police officer, whoever whoever the bill affects. And that's, sort of one way to maybe, find a little more time to get at those stories. But the first one is just, you have to look at that bill going in, and after you've been on the beat long enough, you kind of know, is this going to be one that is controversial? Is it going to sail through? Is it something that's just going nowhere based on who the sponsors are? And some of that's important too in deciding what weight to give it for the readers and really for your own time that you're spending on it.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. I know him. Haley B. Miller with the Gannett, Ohio Bureau. So I think all of us are at the mercy of two external forces, well, a lot of external forces on this beat, but two come to mind, metrics and competition with other State House reporters. So knowing that, how do you guys balance this kind of push and pull between covering the impactful meat and potato stuff versus the politics? Because we all know people like to talk about the politics and read about the politics, but as I think Alex alluded to, some of the stuff that gets talked about in the State House is just crap that doesn't actually mean anything.
Yeah, I'll say up front, I think we can do a better job at that ourselves. I think our Capitol team, and you'll meet Molly in a couple days, I think she's on the schedule, they hate to be beat, and that's a great trait, for a journalist. And they hate to give up a story because, well, we're the experts on it, and we should, this collection of reporters in Madison should be owning all of that. I think what you have to be willing to do on some of those things is occasionally understand maybe you will be beat. But as long as it's not on, it depends what story you're getting beat on, right? In most cases, I've tried to instill and mention to our Capitol team multiple times, if it's a routine story, the AP is there, okay? I'm not to minimize the AP, but we're paying them, right? And we can use that content. And if it's a 10-inch story about some bill that was introduced or passed, yeah, your expertise might be a little different, but it's not appreciably different for the reader. And you can take that time and put it into something that is specific to our audience or our readership, or to invest it around what the legislators in our area are doing or interested in. So it is a huge struggle because, like I said at the outset, if I look across our newsroom, we don't really have any competition at City Hall. Okay, to be blunt about it, the TV stations will follow what we put in the newspaper. We don't have a lot of competition for concert reviews or anything in the life section. No one else covers Milwaukee Public Schools. You go down the line, and it's basically professional sports and the Capitol Bureau and our Washington reporter who are facing that competition and are driven and affected by it in a different way than if the City Hall reporter says, well, 3 things came up at the committee today. We're much more able to say, well, which can wait and which do we jump on? So it's a real tendency, and I think often what makes the reporters covering state government so good is that they have that competitiveness. But sometimes it's just, you have to go for the bigger story, or look that if everybody's going one way, and that's the other factor of that competition, is everyone feels like they have to match that story that someone put out there. Well, maybe it's not the greatest story, and maybe there's a better story over here that nobody's looking at. And that's where I think you have to really kind of look at the playing field and try to assess with your readers, what are the topics of most interest to them. I will say when we were in Lansing, Michigan, it was my second job, and we had the Detroit News and the Free Press and the AP and multiple news services and the Grand Rapids Press. There's a lot of competition there. But one area that we wanted to carve out was, for our readership, what happens to state employees was hugely important and less important for other places. So when I got there, I tried to dig in on some of the departments and places that people might not have spent a lot of time with, because if you're in Lansing, you care about the state government pension system in a different way than you do if you're a reader in Port Huron or Battle Creek. So it's sort of thinking too about that beat and who is your audience versus other audiences, and what are the stories that are universally interesting versus what's maybe more narrowly interesting to your readership.
Hi, Ben Giles from KJZZ in Phoenix. Kind of an exciting and terrifying moment in my newsroom is we're hiring 2 state house and politics reporters. So a bureau of 1, me, is going to be a bureau of 3, and I'm going to step up into sort of a hybrid editor role. I wonder what advice you have for someone stepping into that role anew, leading the State House coverage.
Okay, that's a great question. I'm glad you're hiring. It just brought to mind when I left the Capitol beat in Lansing, Michigan, they replaced me with 2 reporters, and I was really pissed because I was like, you owe me a whole nother salary for the last year and a half that I was doing this. But I think any time as you're becoming an editor, I mean, first it's a different world, and sometimes the skill sets translate from a reporter to an editor, but it requires a different vantage point. You're going to have to sort of manage the workflow for other people. Being a reporter who's done the job recently, I mean, even just immediately prior, I mean, that's going to help you if you approach it humbly and help the reporter understand things without feeling like I'm doing my old job and I wouldn't do it that way, and here's what you should go call. So I felt when I became an editor about, I think it was 14 or 15 years ago, I had been City Hall reporter, then our enterprise editor for just about 6 months, and then took over our investigative team. And I felt like, having been a reporter, I could help the people working on a story in a different way, because I would know shortcuts and I would know sources, and it wasn't abstract, like you should find somebody to talk about that. It'd be like, you should talk to so-and-so because they know the issue very well and they'll help you understand it. Or don't forget that document because that is always the key and has this information you're looking for. So you should, I think, leverage that and use that to your advantage. But it's important to let the reporter discover things on their own. And I don't just mean like finding a scoop on their own, but they may discover on their own that, I bit off too much I could chew on, more than I could chew on this one, or you have to let them sort of make their own way on the topic and the story, and recognize that, they may have a different way of telling it, and that may be great. We've got a lot of people in our newsroom who will tell the story the same way. So if I'm dealing with a newer, younger reporter who's got a new way to tell it, that's awesome, because it's causing us to think differently. And my universal piece of advice for people who are becoming editors is, you're going to find, especially if you're editing word copy, but the same would hold for audio bites and things like that, is you should have a reason for every change you make. It shouldn't just be, well, I like it better. You should be able to explain why you're changing something or challenging it. The reporter ought to be able to justify why they're doing it their way. And if there's a tie, the tie goes to the reporter. And I think that's important, because it can't be like, well, my way, because I'll throw my business card on the table and it trumps your business card. But that if there's an equally good way to tell it, you've got to give the reporter latitude to do that, because ultimately that relationship has to go way beyond the single story or a week's worth of stories or a legislative session. You've got to have that trust and connection built up for the long haul.
Hi, my name is Sonia. I'm a journalist with Time. I live in New York City. I had a question about whether you had any advice on building new audiences, and what I mean by that specifically is you spoke about who is this story for, right? Is it for the people in the Capitol? But when you're trying to report on the people most affected, and I say this in the context of, sometimes I've had conversations with editors where, a story is considered being like too in the weeds or like too insular if it's like about a particular community, whether that's a religious community or like a racial or ethnic community. So, and part of that obviously is like maybe you don't have that audience already, so you're not getting the page views from covering that story the first or the second time. But do you have any advice on like a reporter level for like how to handle those conversations or how to think about contributing towards like expanding the kinds of people that are reading your work, and maybe pushing back in some of those conversations with editors?
Yeah, that's a super question, and I'm going to relate to it around what I always hate the phrase when people say underserved communities, right? But the same construct applies, and I hate underserved because if you just look at it in writing, it looks like undeserved. You can just read past it and you don't see that. It's really groups and folks who aren't coming to us now who we want to be reading us. And the first thing to keep in mind is we need a lot of patience to get them. They might not be reading us or listening to us for deep-seated, long-standing reasons. We've ignored them for a long time. And just because we start doing a couple stories, and if those stories don't get massive traffic and interest, it doesn't mean the story's not worth doing. It may mean that we've got to figure out that connection to get to them. Because if you figure that reader may not be coming to Time Magazine or the Columbus Dispatch or the Detroit Free Press or whatever the institution is, so how would they even know that you're writing about it or telling that story? So there's got to be a baseline willingness to dig in and be patient to work it through, because you might have to write 10 stories about that, 20 stories, whatever, to break through. That said, I think there are ways that you can proactively try to break through. So you try to figure out where are folks in this audience I'm after getting their information. Is there, with Time Magazine, we have a great opportunity, I think, to say, can I get on some local radio stations or different things to talk about my story and reach out and connect with, the host or someone to be on the air? Are there influential leaders in the communities that I could reach out to and talk with and make some connection to sort of start to break down any barriers and to get on their radar screen? So if they're reading your story, they might be sharing it online. They might, that may be, anyone who's thinking, how did you go to that movie? Or my friend recommended it. It's sort of, you've got to see that. So there's a lot of things like that you've got to really dig in and do. And it applies to, I want to get more audience around, school choice advocates, the same way it might be, I want to get more audience around a particular, racial or ethnic community. You've got to figure out some of that. Where are they getting the information? Where, how do I get it in front of them? Who is a trusted person? Have you made contact with anybody in the community, or are you just saying, well, I'm writing about your community now? So there's a lot of things like that you can do, and really you should probably sit down with a strategy going in of, how do I do that, analyze some of those questions, what does success start to look like for you, so you can measure it that way, because those stories, especially out of the gate, may not measure up to some other story, and in the chase for audience things, people, you may get more clicks here. But when I look even at our state government team, we've got great audience, right? Those numbers are huge. But when you dig in, they're primarily our subscribers. And that's great. We want to super serve our subscribers because we want to keep them coming back, and we want to be able to charge them more over time to build a sustainable model. But they've got great content. And how do we get that content in front of more people? And there's different ways to do that, to get, to tell this story in a different way. That, when you've got, how does this work? Q&As, what's the top this? All these things that people might get to. They're the stories often that you might click on when you see them in your X feed, I guess it is now, rather than your Twitter feed and different places. Those are the things that pull you in. And one pitch I've been making to our team over and over is, when you write a story, think about, it's breaking news, right? Just focus on the breaking news in that spot. Because what we have a tendency to do, and our reporters are so strong at this, is they can go from an 8-inch story to a 25-inch story in literally like 10 minutes. Okay, so you say, well, why not? Let's make it this long. Well, if the lead on the story is, Planned Parenthood is going to restart abortions in Wisconsin. And then after about the 8th paragraph, you start to put in all of this tremendous knowledge you have about what happens next and what does it mean and can this be sustained and all these questions. Readers, when they see it and they're scrolling, they're going to see that headline, Planned Parenthood is going to reinstitute abortions in Wisconsin. And why click? You know that, right? But if if you write the short bite and then write a piece that says, here's what's next for abortion access in Wisconsin, well, now you've got a whole new audience, and you're not just giving away that expertise, and you're not burying that expertise so that people don't see that it's in there, because a lot of people scroll for the news, and if it's the same way on the sports scores, the headline is the Packers lost in excruciating fashion, by the way. Not that I'm bitter, but if the headline is more around, what does this mean going forward? Or the headline was, look at the rookie, all the points are scored by rookies on Sunday. All these things, you pull those out and you're going to get into those stories in a different way than just the basic headline on it.
Monica Harkins, WDRB, local TV in Louisville. So I heard you mention TV reporters, and I was kind of wondering, what do you think TV reporters are doing okay at as far as covering the State House, and what should we be doing better? I know it's a little bit of a twofold, but then I also had a question on self-editing or any editing tips in the State House realm. There's not anybody else in the TV part that's in the nitty-gritty like I am when I'm at the legislature. So my editing that I'm receiving is more like grammar, literally, rather than like content. So it's really difficult to make deadline and challenge yourself on content and edit yourself at the same time. So those are my two questions.
Okay. Are you there full time, or you kind of drop in and out pending what else
3
is
days a
happening?
week, I get
Okay.
to be there, which is not always the best. But it's during the legislature, I get to be there every of those 3 days.
Yeah, so on the first question, I think TV has a extra challenge because, there's so many visuals involved, and you can only show so many visuals of people standing at a podium talking, right, or sitting around a table talking. And to go get that video of the classroom, you might just be maybe drawing from file images or get them out there. And it's hard to get physically to all those places in the way that a reporter, even by phone, can get them a lot more quicker. So I think you've got kind of a disadvantage from the get-go from those two points. But I will say I don't spend a ton of time watching TV news here in Wisconsin. We know we've got some reporters who are quite respected. One just beat us. I was complimenting our reporters on their scoop Friday afternoon on the funding for the upgrades to the Brewer Stadium. They kind of sheepishly said, oh, the CBS 58 reporter had it first. And I was like, okay, well, good job on getting it out 30 minutes later, but they got it out fast. So, I don't pay close attention to all of those things, but in terms of the self-editing, I think that applies in a lot of places. And I'll give some of the same advice to any reporter who's covering anything. There's going to be other reporters you admire who do something well. And I always suggest, if you're a reporter, whether you're starting out on a beat or in your career, and you see how a reporter look at their story and try to deconstruct it. How did they do that? Why did they lead with that and not this? How did they get that quote? What question must have been asked to derive, that response? Why did they hold off on that information for a kicker at the end? And really to try to analyze it, because when you do that, you can sometimes apply the same sort of structure, to your own work and start to think of your own work in that that same, deep dive scaffolding behind the piece. The other thing that is cool about today is you can probably reach out to that reporter and ask them. Okay, and I mean, it's one of the wonders and miracles and cool parts about the internet and everything else is you can connect with people and they're probably going to tweet back, and everybody likes to talk about their work, and you can develop your own schooling there. I always tell this story. We had several years ago a young digital data viz person, we would call him today, she was building apps and telling stories visually for us, and she was stumped. This is back in the days when you were using Flash rather than coding and things on a page. And I went up to her and I was talking to her, and I don't have any background in that, so I can't help her through other than to try to help her think it through. And finally she says, "Oh, I think I'm going to be okay because I got my college textbook out and I looked up who wrote it, and I reached out to them by email, and I'm talking to him this afternoon." I mean, that's the kind of thing. You've got that ability, if you like somebody, to follow them, to see all their stories, to do that, to read them, to reach out, to talk to them, and people I've always found, are more than willing and gracious with their time. So that's one way to do it, especially if it sounds like you may be in a remote place from your newsroom, so you probably don't get the same opportunity to sit down side by side with an editor or to really, go through, well, what were you thinking on this or what were you thinking on that? And acting on deadline, that's always, it's hard to develop any sort of coaching relationship on deadline because, you want the reporter getting the most up-to-date information, and it's in a file, land at the last minute, so it's hard sometimes to carve out the time off hours or later on to say, okay, let's sit down and go back through that story, because the reporter's on to the next thing, the editor's on to the next thing. But maybe in another way too is just get on your editor's calendar, once a month, once a week or whatever. So let's take 30 minutes to go through what the work was and get some of that feedback.
I'm Randy with West Virginia Public Broadcasting. You talked about horse race coverage, not to do it. And most of the people in this room, I think all the people in this room, care about covering the issues, care about serving their community. But I'm being bombarded with horse race stuff right now. The governor's running for Senate. The cabinet members and agency leaders are running for governor. The House and Senate committee chairs are running for agency leaders. I mean, and my news director says, we're public broadcasting. We don't cover horse races. And my assistant news director, who is a fiery Irishwoman, says, why aren't we covering these, Mm-hmm. This tete-a-tete is what people, what's the rule of thumb there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we're sometimes guilty of it too. We'll write, the polling story, and I think some of it becomes, are you just going, how are you using that data in the poll? Is the lead so-and-so is up by such and such, and they used to be up by such and such, or reverse, or are you getting deeper into it, into some of the crosstabs and things to explain, where is that support coming from? Why is it diminishing? How does it differ from somebody else? We've got he's now retired for us, Craig Gilbert, but he still writes for us periodically around through a fellowship at Marquette University. He's our longtime Washington bureau chief. And the last 10 years of his career were probably focused almost entirely on data and polls, but it was some of the most fascinating stories you could read because he would dig in and look at regions of the state and TV markets, and just to read that story, it provided the information that was in the polls, but it really was using it to tell you something about the electorate and what is happening, and might explain things. I mean, he wrote a great piece just the other day. There's a big issue in Wisconsin around the state legislative maps, and one of the new Supreme Court Justice, Janet Protasevich, called them rigged during the campaign. She won, tipping the balance, so now the Republicans want her to recuse herself from all of this. And Craig was able to look at the numbers and say, you know what? They are rigged. Okay, for whatever reason, they call it rigged or stacked or whatever, that if you look at how the analyses are, that, it would predict in the abstract like 63 Republican seats in the Assembly, and they got 64. And it's never been, more than one off, I think, either way over the last 10 or 20 years. So he's able to do that looking at the numbers, and he often will build in polls and other things. But I think some of it is, if you have to do that horse race story, I would say get in and out of it as soon as you can, or if you're in it, try to drill down a little bit to the other groups so that there's more to it than just that headline of so-and-so's in the lead and not. And also always remember the margin of error, because people sort of want to say, oh, they're leading and they're not, and what happened, and you see all the, some places, sometimes you have to do them, but those polls, as we've seen in recent elections, are getting less and less reliable. The pollsters will tell you they have to try harder and harder to get the adequate sample size. People might opt out. They might be unwilling to say, yes, I'm supporting this candidate. So what you're getting isn't the same quality that it might have been 30 years ago or 20 years ago. You're getting a snapshot of a portion of the electorate that will participate in polls.
Statehouse reporter, but I took these quarterly campaign finance numbers that are required by state and federal. And then I got a hold of the head of the poli-sci department at the university to have them analyze it for me. And that way I could humanize it and turn it into something that would affect people. Just looking for more ways to figure out to do that to keep both my bosses happy.
Hey, Blair Miller with the Daily Montanan. So I've been in this career about 15 years now. I've worked in 4 capitals, and so I feel like I've seen sort of how the business has shrunk over the years. In your experience, I guess, what do you see as increasingly missing as the industry's changed in your career? And what could we focus better on that maybe doesn't feel like it gets so much coverage as it used to?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was covering state government in Michigan, I was added to the Capitol team, so I was a third reporter on our team, and then one of the reporters left. I think she went to the AP, and then we had 2, and then, as I said, we got 3 again when I left, so that's what's still, I'm a little bitter about that. But I think just as you shrink it, you're shrinking the staffing, and you're increasing the expectation of how quickly you can turn out stories. Because I think any Capitol reporter today is probably writing more stories than I was in a given day. And you're also trying to write it throughout the day and updating it. So in my tenure, you'd be able to pause and reflect and write the one definitive story and get it out there. So that kind of churn doesn't really allow as much time to stop and reflect and to write that lead or make that extra call. So I think what gets missed is, are you talking to even an outside expert who isn't on the payroll of one of the parties or the elected officials? Do you have the time to stop and get a reality check on that issue and how it works on the in a practical level out in the world? So I think it's incumbent and important for the reporters to get out and make some of those connections when you have time, especially if you're in a state that it's a part-time legislature or you've got downtime between elections, is to really get out, meet some people, some experts. There's going to be people in each area, whether it's who are the people in the state who are the most engaged on issues of poverty and low-income housing or whatever, and go say, this week I'm going to this is my poverty and low-income housing month, and I'm going to reach out to a person every week and find a new person just so that I know they'll respond to my phone call or my email on a timely basis because they know me and I'm probably going to rise to the higher up on their list. So there's things like that I think get squeezed out because of the intensity and the timing to do it. And you think, okay, you're at this news conference and you're tweeting and then you got to write an update and then another thing happens and you get to the end of the day and sometimes the end of the week or the end of the month, and you haven't talked to anybody outside that group, that's a problem, So what you want to do is figure out what are the best ways to facilitate that within the reality of what I'm dealing with as a reporter. And it might be, hey, I just got to ping you on this. Is this how that proposal works? Or if they change the cutoff on this, is that going to rule out a lot of people? And it's sort of, you want to build a system that has that kind of sourcing for you in whatever state you're in, so that you can quickly get it. And you have to find people who understand that idea of you need it now, right? And often it's going to be people on the front line, because quite often the folks in academia they operate on a whole different schedule. And they might be the best expert on it, but unless you can get them to understand that you need it now, not in 2 days when they catch up to their email or something. So you find those people, and I think that will help, open avenues on those stories in the moment. And I always feel like, I know I said before, the election cycle is so intense and it keeps going, but there are periods where things do slow down a little bit. And if you're in a session, in an off-election year, to me that's always been the year or that time to dig in and try to put people, on the record for what they support or what they would do, and to raise issues and problems. And when you get into the campaign, that's when you can hold them accountable for what they said. And if you didn't take that first step, it's harder to get into an accountability posture with the people you're talking to, because they can say anything. You didn't try to press them on it, and they're in a campaign bubble, and they're not as likely to talk with you and say, here's how I would approach that issue, or here's, concerns and things like that. So now you got 2 or 3 handlers to get through, and they're programmed, and they're going to say something, and you can never get an authentic quote from them. So it's sort of, you have to take the long view on some of that too, in both fronts of kind of develop these other sources that will allow me to quickly, expand and add depth to my story, and can I approach the speed in a way that I'm putting people on record. Would you support this? Would you support that? And then you can hold them to it, later on.
Hi, I'm Lynn from Cal Matters. I wanted to talk about something about bias. Our organization likes to say that it's nonpartisan, and I'm the newsletter writer, so not only are stories going through the lens of our reporters, I then take those stories and kind of filter it through my lens and my editor's lens, and we work together, and we do, try our best to be nonpartisan, but we do still get feedback from readers saying, like, this is biased, and why didn't you cover this, or why didn't you mention the opposition at the same length as the supporters? So what's your kind of worldview on how we can be as, I know it's not really possible, but unbiased as possible, or keep our coverage as nonpartisan as possible, but giving weight appropriately to the right sides?
Yeah, boy, that's my next seminar session for a couple hours, digging into that one. There's so much there. I mean, I'll just give a couple just quick reflections. I mean, you're right. I mean, everybody brings their own background and perspective to an issue, and what I consider to be the most important element of that bill might be different than what you do. And that's a good thing, right? Because in a newsroom especially, you want to have different points of view expressed, and hopefully in that process you can derive, get closer to I would say, maybe like the word balanced, because people think balance is like, well, that's perfectly even. There are 2 people on this side, and there are 2 people on this side, and look, it's even. But if the 2 people on this side are demonstrably wrong, and the 2 people on this side aren't demonstrably wrong, well, you have a problem if you give them equal balance, right? So I think a lot of it is to go through a rigorous process that for the reporter and the editor on each story to think about from the beginning, are we talking to enough sources? Is it a varied group of sources? What has been said about this topic? What do studies show? What does the data show? And to get away from, the tendency of this happened and this person reacted, because then you can argue, well, it's in balance, like we got both sides of the issue, but sometimes there's 6 sides to an issue, right? And if you got both sides, you're missing, what, 80%, 60% of the issue, and so that's its own problem. I mean, there's also, just to bear in mind, and I realize this is an issue I think about a lot, but I don't have the clarity on it that I think very few people do, because it's so hard to get your arms around. But the reader's coming at it with a bias too, and they often don't recognize that. And I've taken to that now in my role as editor. I frequently get these, flamed emails of like, you guys are terrible liberal bias, and then, okay, less occasionally, but still often, you're conservative bias. I saw this a lot when we launched PolitiFact 13 years ago, and you'd get one campaign saying, oh, you only rate this on Republicans and this on Democrats. You'd go in the numbers, and it's just not true. You'd explain it to them, and it still wouldn't get through. So now I always, when I get a general thing, I'll send a note back. It says something to the effect of, I appreciate all of our readers, and I want to understand your point, your view. Can you tell me what example you're talking about? And 9 times out of 10, I don't hear back from that reader, okay? Because because I can't respond in a general way to say you're biased toward one side or the other, because I will never convince that person. I mean, I simply won't. And I just have said I don't want to waste my time anymore trying to broadly say, okay, we're not biased toward liberals or against liberals or conservatives and whatnot. But I am happy to dig in if someone says, oh, well, you used this phrasing here. Why didn't you use this phrasing? So now you've got something you can engage with a reader on. And really, it's important that they hear what they're saying, because sometimes they're right. Sometimes it's not a case of bias. Sometimes it's, on coverage decisions and things, it's like, well, we would have loved to cover that. We didn't have enough people. Why did we cover this and not that? Well, because we had someone available and they were there and not. And I always try to encourage readers over time to look at us and not to say, just pull out that one story and say that story is evidence that you've got this bias. Or worse, that this bias is some negative intent, toward them. Because, we all know, and I've seen these cases where you're writing a story, everybody's doing the best they can. And I try to focus readers and complainers when that comes up around, okay, this is a reporter who is doing his or her best work. Nobody sets out to be biased or to try to write a biased story. In fact, people go to such lengths sometimes. If someone could sit in on an editor's meeting or a reporter-editor discussion around something, they would be amazed at how much conversation goes into that to try to choose the right language. But again, I realize I'm kind of rambling around the bias question, but I think there's some unwinnable discussions there. What you can do on a day-to-day basis is always be checking yourself. And when you hear the complaints, don't throw them all out. If it's a general, oh, you're just a crazy liberal journalist or whatever, that's not helpful. But if someone says, why did you cover this and not this? Why did you use this phrasing for this side of the issue as opposed to that phrasing? Then you've got an area for you to engage with the reader on, and you've got an area that's a potential room for improvement in your organization in that presentation, because now you know how it's being perceived. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. Probably not, but
Hello, my name is JC Whittington. I'm with Politico in Washington, D.C. But I am a video journalist. And so oftentimes I find myself having to really advocate on my behalf for parts of the newsroom budget to be given towards me so that I can cover stories adequately. As you know, Politico is full of writers. We have a video team, it's very small. And so my question is, if you were, my top editor, and I'm coming to you to try to advocate for more of the budget to go towards video stories, what are the things you would need to know from me that would allow for you to give me the green light to be able to have the budget to report on stories, really like for travel? Yeah.
Okay, that's a really insightful, good question. I'm going to pretend I'm a political editor. I mean, I feel like they're so, and I subscribe to a lot of their newsletters, read them all the time and you're right, I think it's a very text-driven thing. But when I'm not reading things for work per se, and the reason I read those is to kind of know what's happening, coverage-wise, I'm not drawn to long text-driven things. I've read so much in the course of the day, I don't really want to open a file and see words. And if the aim of Politico to have I think one thing is to understand, and I don't know necessarily, you certainly would, is the aim to have the video to augment the text, so it's sort of a verification tool. You can see for yourself what was said or whatever, or is it more, does it stand on its own in a way on different platforms to try to draw a new audience? Because that second part becomes much more valuable if they are trying to draw a new audience, because then you can say, look, here's what we know about videos. Here's what the metrics show. Here's how long you have to engage. If you want to be active on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or wherever you are, this is how you've got to do it, because that's how everybody else is. That's how people consume the content. So I think your first step is to figure out, do they consider video as an important platform and mechanism to drive new traffic and get information to people? Or is it, oh, we just told you about that Marjorie Taylor Greene interview and we want to show you the video of it so you can listen? Because if it's the latter, you've got a much steeper hill to climb, because from that vantage point, any video is as good as the next video, almost, right? They just want to have something in that spot to pull and hold your attention. If it's the former and they want to grow the audience, I think you can make a really strong case around, where is that audience? They're on these other platforms, and you can pull in new readers, which may bring in new revenue, which may do all of these different things. Now, Politico is an interesting case study because, I don't think they really have a general audience, or they may not be intending to. If they are, it hasn't registered for me as an average person. Their audience is the insider, and that person may just want to see that Marjorie Taylor Greene video, and it's a tougher thing. But I would really get that first question kind of reconciled and then go at it and say, okay, are there some numbers you can point to show, a story or an item that had a video did better than the other stories? Does it always have to be, does your platform allow the video to function on its own, or does it have to be kind of connected and tied into something different? If it has to be tied into something different, then you can look at, stories with videos versus without videos. If it's separate and someone comes to the website and you can just tell that story in video, that's, you've got its own numbers. And the other way, too, is to say there's some stories that just have to be told by video, right? As a long-standing word person and print journalist, I don't even hate to think of print journalist, but a journalist who does print in a substantial part of our business, it's so much better today than when I started out, and we had, one way to deliver the news, ink on paper on your doorstep at 6 o'clock. Now we've got reporters and collaborating with photojournalists, and the photojournalist who's writing stories, and they're out finding the stories that, sometimes those words, as however elegant and eloquent they are, they can't replace that image and that film of somebody, the emotion that of a scene or the devastation of a scene. And that's really another selling point, I think, that, you know, if you're only reliant on words, you're only using one of the tools in your toolbox, right? And the video is how people experience life in a different way. The same way TV became, you know, crowded out radio. The same way radio made an impact on print papers back in the day. That all these things you're kidding and connecting with viewers in this case in a different way. And I think that's maybe some things to sell them on.
Hey, William Malhado with the Texas Tribune. I was really intrigued with the kind of story you said about how you engage with your readers by sending them like a survey that they mailed back to you. And I think, you know, that seems like a really, really awesome way to actually engage your audience, though I don't think anyone's going to be mailing anything to us these days. And so I'm curious if you have seen or have ideas about other ways to engage with your audience in a really like substantial way, particularly those who are going to be like impacted by policy and not just being like, for example, I often get like connected with people who will be impacted by policy via like nonprofits or other groups that are advocating for or against legislation. And sometimes it's great, but other times it feels like a little bit like I'm kind of just like repeating, you know, the same or working with the same sources that journalists everywhere else are. So I'm trying to like obviously diversify that source network.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a whole menu of things that you can do these days, from, you know, reader polls to Google Forms to, you know, submit questions to, you know, try to generate content around what readers want. One thing I'll just spend a little time on that we've done a fair amount of at the Journal Sentinel is trying to connect with people in person. And obviously that was very difficult during COVID times. A lot of our efforts became you know, Teams meetings and Zoom calls and things. But there were a couple projects where we were especially successful on this. And, you know, one of them was around a project our reporter and columnist James Causey did on, I think I'm forgetting the name. It was around the city of Milwaukee and basically like 5 or 6 top issues. And one of them was youth and finding things for the youth to do and be engaged on in a productive way and stay out of trouble. And for James's series, for each one of his installments, we wanted to do some sort of engagement event. And we thought it would be pointless to have a panel discussion about youth, okay? Because you bring in a couple lawmakers, you do this and that, and you have this discussion. And even if you put a youth on the panel, you know, what's the point? So instead, we revisioned it and said, okay, if we're going to do this event and gather folks together, and we made partnering was not a bad thing in this environment, depending on the framework and who you're partnering with. You know, in this case, we partnered with Running Rebels, which is a youth-focused group in the city. They can help bring youth to our event. We did it on the Marquette University campus, which is kind of central in the city. We said, if a politician is coming, we're going to have them sit at the tables, but they're going to be listening to what the youth are talking about. And one of the youth members at that table is going to report out what the discussion was. And in the hallway afterwards, we invited, I probably had a dozen different groups that are engaged with youth and things they can do over the summer, whether it was how to find a summer job or volunteer opportunities or tutoring or all these different things. We wanted it to be different and meaningful in a way that wasn't just like, hey, come to our event, and everybody's going to talk for 45 minutes, and then you're all going to go home, and what? You know, so we always think about, if you're doing that event and that engagement, you know, what is the aim? What is the purpose? Are you doing it to put yourself in your organization in a positive, productive light in the community? But is it because you want to develop new sources? If you're out at different community events, which we are, and you're gathering people's names and their interests, what are you doing with that? You know, we had for a while someone on our editorial staff, they were gathering that, they'd go to different events and they'd put it in a spreadsheet. And it's like, well, did you share the spreadsheet with reporters? You know, because if you did, now we've got some people that we know are interested in what they're interested in that we can talk with. So really thinking about any of these sorts of events and engagement, if you're going to a coffee shop, if you're doing a Q&A thing, if it should be with something directly, purposefully and intentionally in mind for what you want to get out of it. And it's not to minimize the need to be present and visible in your community, but there should be something, you know, more than that. And in the case when we did the one around youth, our main mission was we wanted to connect youth with these different groups and activities. It wasn't like, oh, we wanted to get a great story out of it or whatever. We thought, so we built it around that goal. So that's just maybe a couple thoughts on when you do some engagement type things.
I'm Sarah with VT Digger, which is a nonprofit newsroom in Vermont. I'm very intrigued by some of the things that you said about the pace of journalism in the 21st century and the 24 hours news cycle. I'm wondering if burnout is a conversation in your newsroom and how you're kind of talking about that with your reporters and thinking about that as a manager. And I ask this question not just selfishly as a reporter, but also because I'm a union officer for my union, and it's the number one thing I hear from my guild members.
In terms of the volume and the pace and the workload.
Yes,
and
yeah.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot. I'll tell you, there's some folks in our newsroom who will work and work and work until you tell them to stop. I literally, on nights when I'm there, 6 or 7-ish, and I will walk around the newsroom, and if you're still at your desk, I will say you've got 15 minutes, and I'm having someone who's staying later, Enrique Rodriguez, who's our night person, I'll say, and Enrique, I'm telling Enrique to send you home, okay, because you've got to be able to unplug and disengage. I think a big part of that, the challenge is, the news cycle doesn't stop, but you literally can't be plugged in all the time. And if you are, it's diminishing your how well you're going to do your job, because we've all seen in the big cases, and that's when the newsroom is really conscious of. We had a couple years ago. A guy drives his SUV into the Waukesha Christmas parade and killed like 5 people and injured 60. And for those first days, we're like, okay, you're on and you're off and take your time. And you really honed in, and we did a session around trauma for journalists. And so people do the big things well. But it's really the day-to-day grind, I think, that builds up on people and wears them down. So you've got to figure out how to unplug. And part of being able to unplug is that, does the newsroom have a strong system to back you up, okay? And do you, as a reporter, trust the person who's going to be backing you up? And I'll tell you, in our newsroom right now, that the second part is the bigger the challenge is, because we can look around and say, okay, you're gone, so-and-so will back you up. And the person in that role sometimes doesn't want to disengage because it's like, well, they're not going to do as good as I would on that story. So I'm going to keep on and do this story. But it's hard to get them to see that, yeah, you can do that, but then your story tomorrow isn't going to be as good because you're worn out, or because you've built up this unsustainable level of work and plugged inness, or whatever you want to call it, that you're going to, over time, it's not going to be better. And how can that person who's backing you up ever build the comfort that you need for them that they've got your back if you never let them do the story? So sometimes it's really it's a person to person, house to house kind of thing to get people to understand that and to show that, okay, yeah, that story wasn't exactly like you would have done it, but you know what? It was a good story. and that's what we needed at that moment, was a good story from that person so you could take the time off. And it's really a message that you need the leaders to send consistently. And by that I mean like day to day, and not be like, oh yeah, I want that person to take some time off, but darn it, I really want that enterprise story by tomorrow too. You have to sometimes be willing to sacrifice that story in the short term. But you also have to show it consistently across the newsroom so that everyone knows, oh, it's not just me they're telling to go home, that everybody needs a chance, to go home. And it's tough, because as newsrooms have shrunk and more falls on an individual person, their beat might be much larger than the person who had it, a couple reporters back, that, it's hard for people to give, especially in the environment when you factor in, there's cuts, right? And there's threats of layoffs, and things are always out there. And it's like, do you want to be that reporter who didn't go do that story? Of course not. You want to be out there and doing that story. And that's where you've got to, hopefully you've got editors in the newsroom who recognize that. And if not, you might have to drag them to that perspective. But, if you've got, and I remember my first city editor, he was a hard-charging dude in Marion, Indiana when I started. And he would never have told us to go home. In fact, I remember one time when, this was in the day, we had one deadline, and we were so stupid back then because if our news event was done in the day, and we're in a small town, Indiana, and there's like 6 or 7, 8 reporters, and we would all hang out. We'd go to dinner somewhere, like at a fast food place, and come back. And one time we got back to the newsroom, and we all had notes taped to our desk that said, as I was sitting here at my desk, it occurred to me that if a bomb went off in downtown Marion, I would have had nobody to cover it because everybody was out eating dinner. And it was because someone had forgot to bring the radio with them that we would have had. But it was sort of like, he would never have said, don't do it. But that was in a day when, like I said, we were stupid, and we should have just went home, filed our story, and went to the bar or something, right? And not hung out till we could file it at 8 o'clock and then go to the bar. But it's a different place because, he could reach me at home at 9 o'clock, but then I'd have to drive back downtown and log in. I couldn't just, oh yeah, I'll whip something out. Oh, I saw that on Twitter. I'll follow that for you. It's just such a different environment that you've got to have editors who are able to see that you're playing the long game. And the short game is, I got to get that out now. I got to grab that story. I got this thing. I got to beat the next place. The long game is that I want to build a sustainable newsroom that draws audience to our great coverage. In order to do that, I've got to have reporters who are able to produce that kind of coverage and not just crank it out, because the cranking it out is commodity kind of stuff. Anybody can say the governor tweeted this and write out, 4 paragraphs and get it up. And the key there is anybody can do that. So if you're not doing it, the breaking news reporter probably can do that. And that reporter has to be willing to have the breaking news reporter do it. And the breaking news reporter is going to be comfortable doing it. But once you get that part settled, it's a lot easier to figure out how do you manage, newsroom, the workload and things like that.
So many newsrooms are struggling with that very issue, and it's something that I think that, as Greg said, managers are coming late to the game to recognize and to deal with, mostly because, as Greg was speaking, we're also hyper competitive, and then you throw in all of the connectivity and the technology available to do that work wherever you are. It puts tremendous pressure on both ends. But I wanted to thank Greg so much for kicking this off tonight and the thoughtful remarks. And thank you for your questions.